What became of the men who fought under the French flag during World War II? When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, France stood in a peculiar and deeply complicated position unlike almost any other nation on earth. She'd been both a victor and a vanquished power. Her soldiers had fought on every continent, in every theatre of war, under every conceivable set of circumstances, sometimes fighting for opposing sides. French soldiers had stormed the beaches of Provence. French soldiers had manned the defences of Vichy North Africa. French soldiers had died in the jungles of Indochina, the deserts of Libya, the streets of Paris, and the frozen mountains of Italy. And French soldiers, in one of history's darker chapters, had worn the black uniform of the SS and marched alongside the Wehrmacht into the ruins of Berlin. What happened to all of them when the war ended? What became of the generals who had surrendered France in humiliating fashion, of the commanders who had crossed the Mediterranean to fight again, of the ordinary soldiers who had spent 5 years behind barbed wire in German prison camps, and of the men who had chosen collaboration over resistance? In this video, we are going to find out. The stories range from the inspiring to the tragic, from the heroic to the damning, and from the triumphant to the heartbreaking. So, without further ado, let us start at the very beginning of this extraordinary journey. To understand what happened to French soldiers after World War II, it is essential to understand the shattering scale of what happened to France during it. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany launched its audacious invasion of France and the Low Countries. Within 6 weeks, the unthinkable had occurred. The French army, widely considered the finest in the world just a decade earlier, had been completely broken. On the 22nd of June 1940, French representatives signed an armistice with Nazi Germany in the same railway carriage in the Pau forest of Compiègne, where Germany had been forced to sign its own armistice in 1918, a deliberate act of humiliation engineered by Hitler himself. The defeat was catastrophic in every sense of the word. Approximately 90,000 French soldiers were killed during the fighting, and the human cost did not end there. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million French soldiers were captured by the Germans, marched into captivity, and transported eastward across the Rhine to work as forced labourers and prisoners of war inside the Third Reich. This was the largest single captivity of soldiers in French military history, and the consequences of it would shape the entire post-war French nation for decades to come. But France's military story did not end with the armistice. Even as the German jackboot came down on Paris, a relatively obscure general had boarded a plane to London and was about to change the entire trajectory of his country's history. His name was Charles de Gaulle, and his actions in the summer of 1940 would echo through the entire post-war world. The story of French soldiers after World War II is, in many ways, the story of two Frances, two armies, and two incompatible visions of honour, loyalty, and national identity. Philippe Pétain stood at the absolute pinnacle of French military prestige when the Second World War began. Born on April 24, 1856, in Cauchy-à-la-Tour in northern France, Pétain had spent a lifetime in uniform and had emerged from the First World War as the saviour of France, the hero of Verdun, the man who had held the line against the German onslaught when it seemed the entire French nation might be obliterated. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 had cost France approximately 350,000 casualties, and it was Petain's calm, methodical leadership that had prevented the battle from becoming an outright catastrophe. He understood, in a way that his more aggressive contemporaries did not, that French lives were not infinitely expendable, and his soldiers adored him for it. By the 1930s, he had reached the rank of Marshal of France, the most prestigious military rank the country could bestow, and he served as Minister of War in 1934. He was, in every sense, the grand old man of French military life, the living symbol of French national sacrifice and resilience. And yet, his story after 1940 would become one of the most tragic and contested in French history. A story of a great man who lived too long and, in his final years, made choices that would permanently destroy the legend he had spent a lifetime building. When France collapsed in June 1940, Pétain was 84 years old. He had been serving as French ambassador to Spain when the crisis erupted, and he was recalled urgently to join the government as vice premier. On the 17th of June, the same day he was appointed Prime Minister in the desperate final hours of the Third Republic, Pétain broadcast to the French people and announced his intention to seek an armistice with Germany. His words that day were chilling in their resignation. He told his countrymen that it was necessary to stop fighting, that it was with a heavy heart he said to them it was necessary to cease hostilities. The armistice was signed 5 days later, and France was divided. The northern and western zones came under direct German occupation, while the southeastern portion, including the storied city of Vichy, became the seat of a new French state, officially called the État français, that chose collaboration over resistance. Pétain became its head of state, invested with virtually absolute power by a vote of the shell-shocked National Assembly on July 10, 1940, and for the next 4 years he presided over a regime that cooperated actively with Nazi Germany, handed over French Jews to be deported to their deaths, and used French police and French soldiers to suppress French resistance. The Vichy regime was not simply a passive collaborator. Under Pétain's authority, the milice, a paramilitary force, hunted down Jews and resistance with a brutality that sometimes shocked even the Germans. French police rounded up thousands of Jewish families, including children, and transported them to transit camps from which they were shipped to Auschwitz and other death camps in the east. The Veldehive roundup of July 1942 saw over 13,000 Jewish men, women and children arrested in Paris by French police and held in appalling conditions before deportation. These things happened under Pétain's government, with his authority and his name attached to them. When Germany finally fell and France was liberated, Pétain was faced with a moment of reckoning. He had been taken to Germany by the retreating German forces in August 1944, but in April 1945, as the war in Europe reached its final days, he chose to return voluntarily to France and face whatever awaited him. He crossed the border at Pontarlier on April 26, 1945, and was immediately arrested. His trial began on July 23, 1945, before the High Court of Justice, and it was one of the most charged and emotionally complex legal proceedings in French history. The charges against him were collaboration with the enemy and crimes against the state. The prosecution argued that Pétain had deliberately surrendered France's sovereignty, helped the enemy wage war against France's former allies, and presided over a regime that had committed crimes against the French people and against Jews. The defence, led by Pétain himself and his counsel, argued that Pétain had acted as a shield for France, absorbing German demands while quietly protecting his countrymen, and that without him the situation would have been far worse. Many former soldiers and veterans testified in his defence, unable to believe that the hero of Verdun could truly have become a traitor. On August 15, 1945, Pétain was found guilty of national indignity and collaboration with the enemy. He was sentenced to death, but the sentence was immediately commuted to life imprisonment by General Charles de Gaulle, who could not bring himself to execute the man who had once been his mentor and patron. De Gaulle made clear that he acted out of respect for the old man's age and his service in the First World War, not out of any sympathy for the crimes committed under Vichy. Pétain was imprisoned on the Île d'Yeu, a small island off the Atlantic coast of France, where he spent the remaining 6 years of his life in declining health. He was partially pardoned in 1951 when he was transferred to a private residence on the island due to his deteriorating condition. He died on July 23, 1951, at the age of 95, the oldest prisoner in France. His burial on the island rather than at Verdun, where he had always hoped to rest, was a deliberate final humiliation, and the question of whether his remains should ever be transferred to Verdun has resurfaced multiple times in French political life in the decades since. Closely linked to Pétain in the catastrophic military decisions of June 1940 was the figure of Maxime Weygand, a man whose biography reads like a novel and whose post-war fate was almost as dramatic as the crimes he was accused of committing. Born in Brussels on January 21, 1867, Weygand's origins were themselves a mystery that fascinated the gossips of 2 generations. His parentage was never officially confirmed, and persistent rumours circulated throughout his lifetime that he was the illegitimate son of Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, or of King Leopold II of Belgium, or of various other prominent European figures. Whatever the truth, he was raised in France, educated at Saint-Cyr, the French military academy, and built a remarkable career as a staff officer. During the First World War, he served as Chief of Staff to Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, and was present at the signing of the 1918 armistice. His subsequent career included a remarkable stint in Poland in 1920. where he helped organize the Polish army's defense against the Soviet invasion, a campaign that ended with the miraculous Polish victory at the Battle of Warsaw, sometimes called the Miracle on the Vistula. Weygand received considerable credit for that victory, though Polish historians have consistently emphasized that the victory was primarily the achievement of Polish commanders, particularly Józef Piłsudski. By 1940, Weygand was 73 years old, recalled from retirement to take command of the French army in its final desperate days after General Gamelin had been dismissed for the failure to stop the German advance. It was too late for any miracle. Weygand arrived to command a shattered force and within days concluded that the situation was hopeless. He became one of the most prominent advocates for seeking an armistice, arguing against the option of establishing a government in exile and continuing the fight from North Africa, a proposal championed by the younger de Gaulle and others. In Weygand's view, the army was beaten and France needed to preserve what order it could. He saw the armistice as a practical necessity. His critics then and since have argued that this assessment was both militarily wrong and morally catastrophic, that France had enormous resources in her empire and her navy with which to continue the fight, and that the choice to seek the armistice was fundamentally a choice to abandon France's allies and her own honour. Weygand served the Vichy regime in various capacities, including as Delegate General in French North Africa, where he built up the army in something resembling a clandestine fashion, a fact that would be used in his defence after the war. However, he was dismissed from this post in November 1941 under German pressure, as the Germans rightly suspected he was not a reliable collaborator. He was arrested by the Germans after the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942 and held in Germany until the end of the war. After liberation, Weygand was arrested in France and charged with collaboration. The legal proceedings against him dragged on for years. In May 1948, a military tribunal indicted him on charges related to his conduct during the armistice negotiations and his service to Vichy. But the charges were ultimately dismissed in May 1948 when the High Court of Justice ruled that the acts attributed to him did not constitute crimes under applicable law. Weygand was a free man, though stripped of his formal standing and living in a France that regarded him with deep ambivalence. He spent his remaining years writing his memoirs, defending his decisions with considerable passion and historical argumentation, and insisting that he had acted in France's best interests throughout. His memoirs, published in the early 1950s, presented a carefully constructed defense of the armistice decision and attempted to reframe his wartime service as something other than collaboration. He died in Paris on January 28, 1965, at the astonishing age of 97. One of the last survivors of the military generation that had commanded in both world wars. His case remains one of the most debated in French military history, with historians continuing to argue about whether he was a pragmatic realist, a coward, or something in between. Perhaps no figure in the entire landscape of French military politics during the Second World War combined such dramatic ambition with such a sudden and violent end as François Darlan. Born on August 7, 1881 in Nérac in southwestern France, Jean-Louis Xavier François Darlan was the son of a former Minister of Justice and came from a solidly Republican bourgeois background. He chose a naval career and rose steadily through the ranks of the French Navy, developing a consuming passion for building French naval power to rival that of Britain. By 1939, he was Commander-in-Chief of the French Navy with the rank of Admiral of the Fleet, the highest naval rank France could bestow, and he possessed a deep and personal Anglophobia that coloured all his political calculations. He resented British condescension toward France and toward the French Navy in particular, and when the British attacked the French fleet at Marcel on July 3, 1940, killing nearly 1,300 French sailors to prevent the ships from falling into German hands, Darlan's hatred of Britain became something approaching an obsession. The Marcel attack, launched on Churchill's direct order, remains one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war, and for Darlan it confirmed everything he had always believed about British perfidy and self-interest. Within the Vichy hierarchy, Darlan rose to extraordinary heights. From February 1941 to April 1942, he served as Vice Premier, Foreign Minister, and Minister of the Interior simultaneously, making him effectively the second most powerful man in France after Pétain himself. During this period, he pursued active collaboration with Germany that went beyond what even Pétain had contemplated, including the Paris Protocols of May 1941, a series of agreements that would have given Germany use of French military facilities in Syria, Tunisia, and West Africa in exchange for concessions. The protocols were never fully implemented, partly because of resistance from some Vichy officials, and partly because German attention turned eastward toward the Soviet Union. But they represented the most explicit embrace of military collaboration with Germany that Vichy ever produced, and they were Darlan's handiwork. By 1942, his influence within Vichy had declined as the Germans increasingly favoured the more overtly fascist Pierre Laval, and Darlan found himself politically marginalised. But fate, in its strange way, gave him one final dramatic role. When Allied forces landed in French North Africa on November 8, 1942, Darlan happened to be in Algiers visiting his son, who was seriously ill with polio. He was captured by the Americans and, in a deeply controversial deal that caused enormous controversy in London and in Washington, the Allies agreed to recognize Darlan as the High Commissioner for French North Africa in exchange for his ordering French forces to cease resistance to the Allied landings. The deal worked militarily, but was politically toxic, and President Roosevelt famously described it as a temporary expedient. The Darlan affair, as it became known, never had time to fully play out. On December 24, 1942, Christmas Eve, Darlan was shot in his Algiers office by a young French monarchist named Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle. He died within hours. His assassin was tried by military tribunal and executed 2 days later, on December 26th. The speed of the trial and execution led to persistent speculation that the killing had been organised by the Gaullists, resistance, or by the British Special Operations Executive, though no conclusive evidence for either theory has ever been produced. Darlan's death conveniently removed an enormous political embarrassment for the Allies, solved the problem of what to do with him after the war, and opened the way for General Henri Giraud to take over as High Commissioner. The question of who ordered Darlan's killing has never been definitively answered and remains one of the genuine mysteries of the war in North Africa. For Darlan himself, there was no post-war reckoning, no trial, no prison sentence. A bullet on Christmas Eve ended the story before history could deliver its verdict. Turning to another general whose fate was decided by the tangled politics of collaboration and resistance, the story of Henri Fernand Dentz is one of genuine tragedy mixed with genuine guilt. Born on December 20th, 1881, in Rouffach in Alsace, Dentz built a distinguished military career in the French army and served with considerable bravery during the First World War. By 1940, he had reached the rank of general and was appointed High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief of the French forces in the Levant, the territory of Syria and Lebanon that France held under a League of Nations mandate. His position placed him in command of approximately 45,000 men, and the decisions he would be forced to make in the summer of 1941 would define his legacy and ultimately destroy him. When Germany invaded Greece and then Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, and Rashid Ali's pro-German government in Iraq launched an uprising against the British presence in Iraq, the Germans identified French-mandated Syria as an invaluable conduit for supplying the Iraqi insurgents and for extending German influence into the Middle East. Darlan's Paris protocols had given the Germans access to Syrian airfields, and German and Italian aircraft began arriving in Syria in May 1941. The British, recognizing the strategic danger, demanded that Vichy France resist German use of Syrian facilities. Pétain and Darlan refused. General Dentz, whatever his private feelings, followed orders and prepared to defend Syria against any Allied attempt to seize it. From June 8th to July 14th, 1941, French and British Commonwealth forces fought each other in the Syrian campaign, a bitter and bloody engagement that cost approximately 4,000 casualties on the Allied side and over 6,000 on the Vichy French side. French soldiers fired on British, Australian, and Free French soldiers. French artillery destroyed Allied tanks. Free French soldiers found themselves fighting former comrades, sometimes even brothers and cousins. The campaign was a particularly ugly microcosm of France's civil war within the larger World War. On July 14, 1941, the 14th of July, France's own National Day, General Dentz signed an armistice with the Allies and surrendered Syria and Lebanon. Dentz was repatriated to France under the terms of the armistice, and continued in Vichy service for a time. After the liberation of France in 1944, he was arrested and brought to trial before the High Court of Justice on charges of intelligence with the enemy, specifically for the assistance he had provided to German and Italian aircraft operating from Syrian territory and for his military resistance to the Allies. The trial, held in April 1945, found him guilty and sentenced him to death, a sentence that was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment. He was imprisoned at Clairvaux, the ancient Cistercian abbey that had been converted into a prison. His health deteriorated rapidly in captivity, and on December 13, 1945, just months after his trial, Dentz died in prison at the age of 63. He never expressed public remorse for his actions, maintaining throughout that he had simply obeyed the orders of his lawful government, an argument that resonated with some and was dismissed with contempt by others. His case raises the enduring question of how much a professional soldier can hide behind the defense of following orders, particularly when those orders required fighting against your country's former allies and assisting the forces of an occupying power. Walter von Brauchitsch, the German commander-in-chief who was ultimately responsible for the conquest of France, famously dismissed the French army as a broken institution in the aftermath of June 1940. He was wrong, and the career of Charles de Gaulle would prove just how wrong he was. Charles-André Joseph-Marie de Gaulle was born on November 22, 1890 in Lille, the son of a professor and deeply patriotic Catholic family. His childhood was saturated with stories of France's humiliation in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and the consequent loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. And from an early age he understood himself to be a man with a national mission. He attended Saint-Cyr and graduated in 1912 with the rank of second lieutenant, joining the 33rd Infantry Regiment under the command of a certain Lieutenant Colonel Philippe Pétain, who recognized the young officer's exceptional intelligence and took him under his wing. It was a relationship that would shape both their destinies in ways neither could have imagined. During the First World War, de Gaulle was wounded 3 times and captured at the Battle of Verdun in March 1916. He made 5 escape attempts from German prisoner of war camps, all unsuccessful, and spent the war in captivity, a humiliation that gnawed at him for the rest of his life and may explain something of the ferocious energy he brought to the events of 1940. Between the wars, he developed a reputation as a military intellectual of the first rank, writing extensively on the importance of armoured warfare and professional armies, ideas that he struggled unsuccessfully to promote within a French military establishment that remained wedded to defensive doctrine and the Maginot Line mentality. His books, particularly The Army of the Future published in 1934, were largely ignored in France but read with great attention in Germany, where Guderian and others were developing the very concepts de Gaulle was advocating. There is a painful irony in the fact that the theory of warfare that destroyed France in 1940 had been articulated years earlier by a French officer whom the French establishment had systematically ignored. During the Battle of France in May and June 1940, de Gaulle commanded the 4th Armoured Division and led one of the few genuinely effective French counterattacks of the entire campaign, at Abbeville on May 28th and May 30th, inflicting significant losses on German forces and briefly threatening their supply lines. He was promoted to the temporary rank of Brigadier General, the only promotion of his career that was not subsequently revoked, and was appointed Under-Secretary of State for National Defence, bringing him into contact with Churchill during the desperate final days of the Third Republic. When Pétain formed his government on June 16, 1940, and it became clear that an armistice was inevitable, de Gaulle boarded a British aircraft the following morning and flew to London. He had with him a small amount of money, a few personal effects, and an absolute refusal to accept that France was defeated. On June 18, 1940, he broadcast on the BBC, calling on all French soldiers and officers to join him in London and continue the fight. The speech, which relatively few French people heard at the time, became one of the most famous in French history, the founding myth of the Free French movement and of de Gaulle's own extraordinary political career. "Whatever happens," he said, "the flame of French resistance must not be extinguished and will not be extinguished." The Vichy government responded by trying him in absentia for treason and condemning him to death. The story of what de Gaulle built from that extraordinary starting point and what he became after the war deserves the full attention that its complexity demands. From the summer of 1940 through the liberation of Paris in August 1944, de Gaulle led the Free French forces, negotiated with and frequently infuriated the Americans and British, organized resistance networks inside occupied France, commanded military operations in Africa, Italy, and ultimately France itself, and built himself into a figure of such political and symbolic weight that by 1944 he was effectively the embodiment of the French nation. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, was his finest hour, and his triumphant march down the Champs-Élysées the following day under sniper fire with thousands of Parisians lining the route was one of the defining images of the entire war. He became the head of the provisional government of the French Republic and oversaw the extraordinarily difficult transition from occupation to liberation, including the thorny and sometimes violent process of purging collaborators. After the war, de Gaulle's political career was anything but smooth. He resigned as head of the provisional government in January 1946, frustrated by the squabbling of the political parties and convinced that the new Fourth Republic constitution was creating precisely the kind of weak, unstable parliamentary system that had contributed to France's collapse in 1940. He spent 12 years in a kind of political wilderness, founding the Rassemblement du Peuple Français, a cross-party movement that failed to achieve his ambitions, and retreating to his home in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises to write his memoirs. Then, in 1958, the crisis of the Algerian War brought him back. France was once again on the edge of civil war, with mutinous generals in Algiers threatening to launch a coup, and the politicians of the Fourth Republic were helpless. De Gaulle was called back to power, and this time he created a new constitutional order, the Fifth Republic, with a strong executive presidency at its centre, essentially the constitution France still has today. He was elected president in December 1958 and served until April 1969, when he resigned after losing a referendum on regional reform and Senate reorganization, characteristically refusing to cling to power once he felt the French people had withdrawn their confidence. He died on November 9, 1970, at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, the day before the 50th anniversary of the 1918 armistice, at the age of 79. He was buried in the village church in accordance with his wishes, in a simple ceremony attended only by his family and close friends, and France, in a sense, has been arguing about his legacy ever since. But de Gaulle was only the most famous of the generals who chose to fight on. The story of the Free French forces is also the story of men like Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, one of the most charismatic and capable French commanders of the entire war. De Lattre was born on February 2, 1889, in Moulieron-en-Pareds in the Vendée, a region with a deep tradition of military service. He had been educated at Saint-Cyr and had served with distinction in the First World War, being wounded multiple times and receiving numerous decorations, including the Médaille Militaire. Between the wars, he developed a reputation as an exceptionally energetic, demanding, and innovative commander, known for his unorthodox methods and his intense personal engagement with his troops. He was also known for a volcanic temper, an absolute intolerance of failure, and a theatrical quality in leadership that sometimes approached the operatic. His men simultaneously adored and feared him. At the time of the armistice in 1940, de Lattre chose to remain in France and serve within the Vichy military establishment, commanding troops in North Africa and then in southern France, where he attempted in his own way to preserve the fighting qualities of the army while nominally serving a regime he despised. When the Germans occupied the previously unoccupied zone of France on November 11, 1942, following the Allied landings in North Africa, de Lattre took the extraordinary step of ordering his troops to resist the German advance, an act of open defiance that was quickly crushed but that demonstrated where his loyalties truly lay. He was arrested by Vichy authorities, tried by a military court, and sentenced to 10 years in prison for disobeying orders. He was imprisoned at Riom, in the Auvergne, but in September 1943 he escaped from prison with the help of the resistance and made his way to London, where he joined de Gaulle's Free French forces. His arrival was enormously significant, as he was the most senior French officer to escape from France and join the Free French, and de Gaulle recognized immediately that he had acquired one of the finest military minds in France. De Lattre was given command of the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy, where he led French and North African troops in the campaigns of 1943 and 1944, and then was appointed commander of the French First Army, which landed on the beaches of Provence on August 15, 1944, in Operation Dragoon. The French First Army swept northward through France with extraordinary energy, liberating city after city, crossing the Rhine in March 1945, and driving deep into Germany and Austria before the war ended. De Lattre's greatest moment of personal satisfaction came on May 8, 1945, when he was present at the signing of Germany's unconditional surrender at Berlin-Karlshorst, representing France as one of the four victorious powers, an honour that was enormously significant for French national pride given the humiliation of 1940. De Lattre signed the surrender document, and in doing so symbolically restored France's honour as a great power. After the war, he served as commander of French land forces, as Inspector General of the Army, and as Chief of the General Staff, but it was his final posting that would define the last chapter of his life. In December 1950, he was appointed both High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief in Indochina, where France was fighting a desperate and increasingly hopeless war against the Viet Minh forces of Ho Chi Minh. He arrived to find a demoralized army on the verge of collapse and immediately began the work of rebuilding French fighting capacity with the same volcanic energy he had always brought to command. He scored significant successes in 1951, checking the Viet Minh offensives and stabilizing the front, but at enormous personal cost. His only son, Lieutenant Bernard de Lattre, was killed in action on May 30th, 1951, near Ninh Binh, and the grief destroyed something essential in de Lattre. He returned to France in December 1951, seriously ill with cancer, and died in Paris on January 11, 1952, at the age of 62. He was posthumously promoted to the rank of Marshal of France, only the second such posthumous promotion in French history, a recognition of his extraordinary service. He remains one of the most celebrated and beloved figures in French military history, a man who had served both Vichy and the Free French, and who emerged with his honour not merely intact, but burnished. Philippe François Marie Leclerc de Hauteclocque is another name that stands at the very pinnacle of French military legend, a man whose story is so improbable and so heroic that it reads more like adventure fiction than sober history. Born Philippe de Hauteclocque on November 22, 1902, in Bellois-Saint-Léonard in Picardy, he came from an aristocratic family with centuries of military tradition. He attended Saint-Cyr, graduated with distinction, and served in Morocco during the Rif War of the 1920s. When the Battle of France ended in defeat in June 1940, Leclerc was a relatively junior captain who had been wounded and briefly captured by the Germans. He escaped, made his way to England, and joined de Gaulle's Free French, adopting the nom de guerre Leclerc to protect his family who remained in occupied France from German reprisals. The choice of a pseudonym was prudent, and it stuck, and he would be known as Leclerc for the rest of his life. What Leclerc accomplished over the next 4 years, starting essentially from nothing, was almost superhuman. He was given command of French Equatorial Africa and organised a force that marched across the Sahara from Chad northward to Libya, covering over 2,000 kilometres of desert in one of the most remarkable military marches of the entire war, and linking up with the British 8th Army in early 1943. He then commanded French forces in Tunisia, in Italy briefly, and was assigned to command the 2nd French Armoured Division, which became the spearhead of the liberation of Paris. On August 24, 1944, Leclerc's division entered the French capital, and on the 25th of August the formal German surrender of Paris was signed by the German garrison commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, to the French, in a recognition of enormous symbolic importance. Leclerc himself accepted the surrender, and it was arguably the single most emotionally charged military moment in French history. A country that had not been liberated by foreigners alone but by its own soldiers, men who had crossed the desert and the ocean to come home. Leclerc's division then fought on through France into Alsace, where on November 23, 1944, the cathedral city of Strasbourg was liberated, fulfilling an oath Leclerc had made in the desert of the Fezzan 3 years earlier that he would not rest until the French flag flew again over the cathedral of Strasbourg. He had made 20 of his officers and men swear the same oath in 1941, the famous Oath of Kufra. And when the flag was raised on Strasbourg Cathedral, every surviving officer who had taken that oath was present. It was one of the most romantic and genuine fulfillments of a military promise in recorded history. After the war, Leclerc was promoted to General of the Army, 5-star equivalent, and was appointed Commander-in-Chief of French forces in the Far East in August 1945, arriving in Indochina just as Japan surrendered. He negotiated the Japanese surrender in the region and then began the first assessment of the military and political situation that would define French Indochina for the next 9 years. He was realistic enough to recognize almost immediately that the military situation was deeply problematic and that the political settlement needed to accommodate Vietnamese nationalist aspirations. But French colonial policy was not ready for such conclusions, and Leclerc was reassigned. He was killed on November 28, 1947, when his aircraft crashed near Colombes in Algeria during an inspection tour. He was 45 years old. The crash was attributed to bad weather, but rumours of sabotage circulated then and have never entirely disappeared. He was posthumously elevated to the dignity of Marshal of France in 1952, alongside de Lattre, and his name remains one of the most revered in the entire French military tradition. Henri Honoré Giraud represents one of the most curious and ultimately melancholy figures in the entire story of French military politics during and after the Second World War, a man of extraordinary physical courage and limited political intelligence who was swept up in events far beyond his ability to manage. Born on January 18, 1879, in Paris, Giraud was a soldier of the old school, a man who believed that victory came from audacity, personal example, and the aggressive spirit of the attack. He served in the French Foreign Legion in North Africa, was captured by the Germans in the First World War, escaped in 1914 by lowering himself from a prison window using knotted bedsheets and disguising himself as a circus performer, walked hundreds of kilometres across Germany to the Dutch border, and returned to France to continue the fight. It was a genuinely extraordinary escape, the stuff of adventure novels, and it established his reputation for personal daring. When the Second World War began, he commanded the 7th Army during the Battle of France and was captured again by the Germans in May 1940. Once again, he escaped, this time in April 1942, from Königstein Fortress in Saxony, climbing down the cliff face on a rope he had woven himself over the course of months, an escape that was even more remarkable, given that he was then 63 years old. He made his way through occupied France into French North Africa, where his arrival was electric, the escape of a genuine hero and senior general galvanizing French opinion. The problem for Giraud was that he was fundamentally a military man trying to navigate a world that had become intensely political. When the Americans landed in North Africa in November 1942, they initially favoured Giraud over de Gaulle as the leader of French forces, regarding de Gaulle as too difficult, too anti-British, and too insistent on French independence and sovereignty. The famous meeting at Casablanca in January 1943 between Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle, and Giraud produced the famous photograph of the two French generals shaking hands under obvious American pressure, a handshake that convinced nobody. Giraud was appointed co-president of the French Committee of National Liberation alongside de Gaulle in June 1943, but the political competition between the two men was entirely one-sided. De Gaulle was a political genius operating in his natural element. Giraud was a soldier who found politics confusing and distasteful. By November 1943, de Gaulle had outmaneuvered Giraud completely, and Giraud resigned the co-presidency. He continued as Commander-in-Chief of French military forces for a time, but was removed from that position too in April 1944, effectively sidelined for the remainder of the war. He was present at the liberation of Strasbourg in November 1944 in a ceremonial capacity and served on various commissions after the war, but his active career was over. He survived a serious assassination attempt in Algiers in August 1944, which wounded him severely, and retired from active service in 1944. He died in Dijon on March 11, 1949, at the age of 70, largely forgotten by a France that had moved on to the triumphant narrative of de Gaulle and the Free French. His fate was in many ways typical of men who were brave and honourable soldiers, but simply were not equipped for the kind of political warfare that the extraordinary circumstances of the war required. Among the figures who emerged from the wreckage of 1940 to play a central role in France's eventual victory, few had a more consistently distinguished military record than Alphonse Juin. Born on December 16, 1888, in Beaune, in Algeria, Juin came from a modest background, the son of a gendarme, and his rise through the military hierarchy was achieved entirely through merit rather than social connection, which was somewhat unusual in the French officer corps of his era. He had attended Saint-Cyr in the same class as Charles de Gaulle, and the two men had known each other since their shared years as cadets. He served with great distinction in Morocco during the Rif War and built a reputation as one of the most capable officers in the entire French army. When the Battle of France came, he commanded an infantry division and was captured by the Germans in June 1940. Released from captivity at the request of the Vichy government, for whom he would serve as a military commander in North Africa, Juin occupied the complex middle ground that so many French officers found themselves in, serving a government he distrusted while preserving the military structure and fighting capacity that France would eventually need. When the Allies landed in North Africa in November 1942 and Darlan ordered French forces to cease resistance, Juin quickly aligned with the Allied cause. He was given command of the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy in 1943 and led it through one of the most demanding and strategically decisive campaigns of the entire Italian theatre. The Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the bloodiest and most prolonged engagements of the entire war, saw Allied forces battering themselves against the German Gustav Line for months without breaking through. It was Juin's French Expeditionary Corps that finally unlocked the position in May 1944, when his Moroccan Goumiers, mountain fighters from the Atlas Mountains, infiltrated through terrain the Germans had considered impassable and turned the entire German defensive position, triggering the breakout that led to the fall of Rome on June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day. The achievement was one of the most brilliant tactical successes of the Italian campaign and was recognized as such by Allied commanders, including the American General Mark Clark, who was lavish in his praise. The Goumiers' accomplishment at Cassino was simultaneously an extraordinary military achievement and an event shadowed by the serious crimes committed by some Goumier units in the aftermath of the breakthrough, including widespread attacks on the civilian population of the Ciociaria region. These crimes, known in Italy as the Maroccinate, resulted in thousands of casualties among Italian civilians and remain a deeply painful subject in Italo-French relations. After the war, Juin served in a series of senior positions of the highest importance. He was appointed resident general in Morocco from 1947 to 1951, where he navigated the increasingly turbulent politics of French colonialism with characteristic bluntness, and then became chief of staff of the French army and subsequently commander of NATO's Allied Forces Central Europe. In 1952, he was promoted to the rank of Marshal of France, becoming only the sixth person to hold that dignity since the Second World War. He was an early supporter of Algerian independence despite his strong colonialist instincts in earlier years and his opposition to the violence of the organization Armée Secrète, the OAS, the terrorist organization composed of French settlers and soldiers who fought against Algerian independence in the early 1960s, showed a capacity for political evolution that some of his contemporaries lacked. He died in Paris on January 27, 1967, at the age of 78. And was accorded a state funeral befitting a Marshal of France. His career, spanning 2 world wars and the painful decolonization of French Africa, is one of the most complete and significant in all of 20th century French military history. Among the generals who built the Free French forces from virtually nothing and then played a decisive role in the liberation campaigns, the name of Marie-Pierre Kœnig holds a special place, particularly in connection with one of the most celebrated defensive stands of the entire North African campaign. Pierre Kœnig was born on October 10, 1898, in Caen, Normandy, and had served with the French Foreign Legion throughout the interwar period, acquiring both operational experience and a deep familiarity with the techniques of desert warfare. When France fell, he joined de Gaulle's Free French immediately, one of the relatively small number of officers who did so in those early desperate weeks, and he quickly proved himself one of the most capable commanders in the Free French ranks. His moment of greatest fame came at the Battle of Bir Hakeim in Libya, from May 26th to June 11th, 1942, when he commanded the 1st Free French Brigade in one of the most extraordinary defensive actions of the Desert War. Rommel's Africa Corps and Italian armoured forces, supported by overwhelming air power, pounded the French position for 16 days in an effort to reduce the strong point that was holding up the advance of the Panzer Army Africa. Kœnig's 4,000 men, including foreign legionnaires, a Senegalese battalion, and a Palestinian Jewish unit, held out against an enemy more than 10 times their number, using the defensive positions brilliantly and inflicting enormous losses on the attackers. When it finally became necessary to break out, Kœnig led the survivors through the German encirclement on the night of June 10th to 11th, and the majority of the force escaped. The battle became legendary in Free French mythology, a demonstration that French soldiers could fight and die with the very finest of any nation's forces. After Bir Hakeim, Kœnig commanded the French forces in Tunisia in 1943 and then was appointed commander of the French Forces of the Interior, the designation given to the resistance groups operating inside occupied France in the critical weeks preceding and following D-Day. He coordinated resistance activities with the Allied invasion and worked to integrate the irregular forces of the resistance into a coherent military structure. After the liberation, Kœnig became military governor of Paris, a position he held until 1944 and then held senior NATO positions throughout the early Cold War period. He served as Minister of National Defense in Pierre Mendès France's government in 1954 to 1955, a government famous for its decision to grant independence to Indochina following the disaster of Dien Bien Phu, making Kœnig one of the French generals who was directly involved in the painful political decisions of decolonization. He was promoted to Marshal of France in 1984, posthumously, having died on September 2, 1970 in Neuilly-sur-Seine at the age of 71. His legacy, defined above all by Bir Hakeim, remains one of the genuinely inspiring chapters in the story of French military resilience. Not all of those who held military authority in wartime France chose honour over complicity, and few figures exemplify the path of collaboration and its ultimate reckoning more starkly than Joseph Darlan. Born on March 19, 1897, in Coligny in the Ain, Darlan had been a genuine hero of the First World War, serving with distinction in the infantry and receiving the Médaille Militaire and the Légion d'honneur for extraordinary personal bravery. He was wounded multiple times and emerged from the war with the reputation of a genuine fighting man, someone who had proved his courage in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. In the interwar years, he drifted toward the extreme right of French politics, joining Action Française and developing an ideology of authoritarian nationalism that was increasingly at odds with the republican institutions of the Third Republic. By the time of the collapse in 1940, he was a man ready to embrace the new order that Vichy represented. What he created, and what he became, represents one of the darkest chapters of French wartime collaboration. In January 1943, Darlan founded the Milice Française, the French militia, a paramilitary organization that served as Vichy France's most effective instrument of internal repression. The milice was, in essence, a fascist police force whose primary mission was hunting down Jews, communists, resistance members, and anyone else deemed an enemy of the Vichy state. What made the milice so particularly feared and hated was not merely its brutality, though that was extreme, but the fact that its members were French. German SS officers could at least be seen as foreign occupiers, acting in a foreign interest. The milice were Frenchmen, killing and torturing their own countrymen, betraying their neighbours, collaborating with an occupying power against their own nation. At its peak, the milice numbered perhaps 35,000 members, though estimates vary, and it operated across the whole of France, including the formerly unoccupied zone. Its members were responsible for the torture and murder of resistance fighters, for the betrayal of Jewish families to the Germans, and for what amounted to an internal reign of terror against anyone associated with the resistance. Darlan himself took an oath of personal loyalty to Heinrich Himmler and the SS, and received the rank of Sturmbannführer, an SS major. In December 1943, he was appointed Secretary-General for the Maintenance of Order, effectively making him responsible for all French police and security forces, and in January 1944 he became Secretary-General of Police with near-dictatorial authority over internal security. Under his authority, the milice's activities intensified dramatically in the first half of 1944, reaching a pitch of murderous collaboration that horrified even some within Vichy. The assassination of former Minister Georges Mandel by the milice in July 1944, in reprisal for the German massacre of Vichy officials following a resistance attack, was an act so brutal and so blatantly political that it shocked France. When the Allied liberation came in August 1944, Darlan fled to Germany with the retreating Germans and then to Italy, where he served briefly with the Italian Social Republic, the remnant fascist state in northern Italy that continued to fight alongside Germany until the very end. After Germany's collapse in May 1945, he was captured in Italy by Allied forces, extradited to France, tried before the High Court of Justice in September and October of 1945, found guilty of intelligence with the enemy and crimes against the security of the state, and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad at Châtillon on October 10, 1945, at the age of 48. Before his execution, he expressed some regret, reportedly acknowledging that he had made mistakes and been deceived by those he trusted, but the scale of the crimes committed under his command left little room for sympathy. His execution was one of the clearest cases of justice delivered in the Epuration, the post-war purge of collaborators, and few who knew what the milice had done disputed that justice had been served. The story of the Epuration, the purge of collaborators that swept France in the aftermath of liberation, is one of the most complex and morally fraught chapters of French post-war history, and it directly determined the fate of thousands of soldiers, policemen, officials and civilians who had served or collaborated with the Vichy regime. The Epuration took two forms. The first was the extrajudicial violence of the liberation itself, the spontaneous and sometimes savage settling of scores that occurred as Allied and Free French forces moved through France in August and September 1944. Collaborators, real and alleged, were beaten, imprisoned, and sometimes shot without trial. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public ceremonies of humiliation that combined genuine moral outrage with mob cruelty. Estimates of the number of people killed in extrajudicial executions during the liberation period range from roughly 10,000 to 30,000, figures that are still disputed by historians. Many of those killed were genuine traitors, responsible for the deaths of resistance fighters and Jews. Others were the victims of personal scores settled under the cover of political justice, or were caught up in waves of violence that had more to do with local power struggles than with the crimes of collaboration. The second form of the Epuration was the legal process, the creation of courts of justice and special tribunals to try those accused of collaboration, crimes against the state and crimes against the French people. These courts heard over 300,000 cases over the following years, issued roughly 125,000 sentences, condemned approximately 6,000 to death, of whom around 3,000 were actually executed, and issued hundreds of thousands of sentences of national indignity, a new legal concept that stripped convicted collaborators of their civic rights, including the right to vote or hold public office. The legal epuration was a massive undertaking that attempted to balance the genuine need for justice with the practical necessity of rebuilding France using many of the same administrators, officials, and institutions that had functioned under Vichy, since the country could not simply erase its entire governmental infrastructure and start from scratch. The result was inevitably imperfect, with some major collaborators escaping serious consequences while some relatively minor figures received harsh punishments, and the tension between justice and national reconstruction was never fully resolved. For soldiers specifically, the epuration created an extraordinarily complex set of questions. Soldiers who had obeyed lawful orders followed a chain of command that was at the time the de facto government of France, and served in campaigns that were militarily legitimate if politically compromised, occupied a different moral category from those who had actively participated in the persecution of Jews or the hunting of resistance fighters. The French army that fought alongside the Allies in 1944 and 1945 included men who had served in the Vichy military establishment as recently as 1942 or 1943, men who had been recalled after North Africa and absorbed into the Free French structure. The practical necessity of accepting these men, whose military training was irreplaceable, created a tension with the moral demand that collaboration be properly punished. De Gaulle navigated this tension with considerable political skill, but not always with perfect justice, and many who had served Vichy in significant capacities were reintegrated into the French military establishment with minimal scrutiny. One group whose fate was decided with considerably less ambiguity than most was the men who had fought in the most extreme form of collaboration imaginable, the soldiers who had joined the Waffen-SS and fought for Nazi Germany in German uniform against the Allies and against France itself. The story of French volunteers in the Waffen-SS is one of the darkest and most disturbing aspects of the entire war, and it deserves serious attention precisely because it is so often overlooked or minimized. French collaboration with Germany was not limited to administrative cooperation, to handing over Jews, or to policing the occupied territory. A significant number of Frenchmen, motivated by ideological conviction, by anti-communism, by fascist ideology, or simply by the desire for adventure and pay, chose to volunteer for military service on behalf of Nazi Germany. The most significant organized unit of French volunteers fighting for Germany was the Division Charlemagne, officially the 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne, which was assembled in late 1944 from the remnants of several earlier French volunteer formations, including the Légion des Volontaires Français contre le Bolchevisme, the LVF, which had been fighting on the Eastern Front since 1941. The LVF had been established in July 1941, immediately after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, as a French volunteer force to fight against communism in the East, and it attracted volunteers from across the French political right, including members of the milice, fascist party activists, former foreign legionnaires, and simply young men who wanted to fight. By 1944, the survivors of years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front were among the most hardened soldiers in any army, men who had experienced the particular horror of war on the Russian steppe and had survived it. When these men and the remnants of other French SS formations were consolidated into the Charlemagne Division in late 1944, the resulting unit numbered approximately 7,000 men, though it was never at full strength as a divisional formation. The Charlemagne Division fought in Pomerania in February and March 1945 as Soviet forces swept through eastern Germany, suffering catastrophic casualties in weeks of savage fighting. The division was effectively destroyed as an organised force, with only a few hundred survivors making their way westward. Among these survivors, an extraordinary number, perhaps 500, made the deliberate choice to travel to Berlin and join in the final defence of the German capital, the last stand of the Third Reich. Their motivations were complex and in some cases impossible to fully understand from the outside. Some were ideological fanatics who genuinely believed in National Socialism and would rather die than surrender to the Soviets or face post-war French justice. Others were men who knew they could expect no mercy from France or the Allies and calculated that death in Berlin was preferable to imprisonment or execution after the war. Still others, by their own later accounts, were motivated by something that approached a nihilistic sense of honour, a commitment to the men beside them that transcended the political cause they were nominally serving. In the final days of April 1945, French SS men were among the last defenders of the Reich Chancellery and the bunker in which Hitler spent his final days. Several received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for their actions in the defence of Berlin, awarded by Hitler personally in the closing hours of the Reich. For those who survived and were captured, the consequences were precisely what might have been expected. Survivors of the Charlemagne Division who fell into French hands were tried before military tribunals on charges of treason, collaboration with the enemy, and bearing arms against France. A number were condemned to death and executed. Others received long prison sentences, but were eventually released under various amnesty provisions. A few managed to evade capture entirely, disappearing into anonymity in France or emigrating to Spain, Argentina, or other countries that had less interest in pursuing former SS volunteers. The French government was not eager to draw prolonged attention to the phenomenon of French citizens fighting in German uniform, and the Charlemagne story remained relatively obscure in mainstream French historical consciousness for decades after the war, surfacing periodically but never receiving the sustained public scrutiny that the subject arguably deserved. It was only from the 1970s onward that a new generation of French historians began to examine the full scope of French collaboration in its military dimension, and the Charlemagne Division gradually moved from footnote to genuinely significant episode in the complex story of France during the Second World War. Among the approximately 1.8 million French soldiers taken prisoner in 1940, the experience of captivity was one of the defining experiences of an entire generation. And what happened to these men during the war and after it returned shaped French society in ways that are still felt today. The sheer scale of the captivity was staggering. In June and July 1940, in a matter of weeks, nearly 2 million men were rounded up and marched into Germany, the largest single captivity in French military history by an enormous margin. They were transported to prisoner of war camps designated as Stalags for enlisted men and Oflags for officers, spread across Germany, Poland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Life in these camps varied enormously depending on location. the particular camp administration, the time period of the war, and the category of prisoner involved. In the early years of the occupation, the Germans hoped that the French prisoners would be useful as a bargaining chip, as leverage over Vichy, and the treatment of French POWs was generally better than that of Soviet, Polish, or Yugoslav prisoners, who were treated with extraordinary brutality that amounted in many cases to a deliberate murder program. French prisoners were entitled to Red Cross parcels, could receive mail, were allowed a degree of cultural and educational activity inside the camps, and were generally not subjected to the systematic starvation and violence inflicted on prisoners from Eastern Europe. However, the conditions were still deeply harsh. French prisoners were put to work in German agriculture and industry in enormous numbers, providing a significant portion of the labour force that kept the German war economy functioning. Some were assigned to farms and developed reasonably tolerable relationships with German farm families. Others were employed in mines, factories and construction projects under brutal conditions. Jewish French soldiers were identified and removed from the general prisoner population, and a significant number were subsequently deported to concentration camps. The exact number of Jewish French POWs who died in concentration camps has never been definitively established, but it certainly numbered in the thousands. For ordinary French prisoners, the experience of 5 years of captivity, of separation from their families, of watching their country being occupied and transformed by a foreign power while they could do nothing, created deep psychological wounds that took years to heal, if they healed at all. Many marriages did not survive the separation. Children grew up without fathers. Communities lost the labour of their most productive men at the very moment they were most needed. The demographic impact of the captivity, coming on top of the casualties of the First World War and the declining birth rate of the 1930s, was one of the factors that shaped France's extraordinary demographic recovery after 1945, when the baby boom was in part a conscious national response to years of loss. The return of the French prisoners of war in the spring of 1945 was one of the most emotionally charged events in French post-war history, and it was handled by the French government with a mixture of genuine care and significant organisational incompetence. When Germany collapsed in April and May 1945, the French prisoners were liberated from their camps by Allied forces advancing from the west and east simultaneously. Some found themselves freed by American or British forces, others by Soviet troops, and the logistics of moving nearly 1 million men across a devastated continent and returning them to France was an immense undertaking. A special ministry under Henri, a former resistance leader, was established to handle the repatriation, and trains were organised to bring the returning prisoners home, their wagons decorated with tricolour flags and welcoming slogans. The reception in Paris and other major cities was genuinely warm and emotionally overwhelming for both the returning men and the families waiting for them. President de Gaulle attended ceremonies to welcome the prisoners and publicly celebrated their long endurance. And yet the reality of the return was more complicated and more painful than the official celebrations suggested. Many of the returning prisoners felt that France had moved on without them, that the country had developed its own narrative of resistance and liberation during the years of their absence, and that there was insufficient recognition of what they had endured. They came back to find that the women who had kept households and farms and businesses running during 5 years of occupation had developed independence and self-sufficiency that sometimes made reintegration difficult. Marriages that had survived the separations sometimes collapsed when the reality of reunion failed to match the fantasy that had sustained both parties through the years of captivity. The returning prisoners found employment difficult to obtain in an economy that had been reorganised around those who remained, and many felt invisible within a national narrative that celebrated the resistance and the Free French, but had little room for the millions who had simply survived captivity without heroism. The psychological trauma of captivity was not well understood by French society in 1945, and there were few mechanisms for addressing it. Men who had spent years in a state of total powerlessness, unable to protect their families, unable to control their own circumstances, unable to contribute to the national effort, carried wounds that were invisible but deep. The returning prisoners were also caught up in the awkward social calculus of the epuration. Many had served in the Vichy military establishment before their captivity, and some had colleagues and friends who were now being tried for collaboration. The category lines were blurry and uncomfortable. The man who had obeyed orders in June 1940 and marched into captivity was a prisoner of war and a victim. the man who had obeyed similar orders in 1941 or 1942 in French North Africa or Syria and been captured there might be in a very different legal position. The returnees from Germany included men who were innocent of any collaboration, men who had actively resisted from inside the camps, and a smaller number who had collaborated with the German administration, providing information about fellow prisoners or participating in German organised work programmes in ways that exceeded what was legally required. The military authorities dealing with repatriation had neither the resources nor the political will to conduct thorough investigations, and the result was an imperfect sorting that allowed some who deserved scrutiny to slip through, while others faced unjust suspicion. Henri Navarre stands as perhaps the single most consequential French general of the post-war decade, not because of any triumph, but because of a disaster so complete and so costly that it ended France's empire in Indochina and changed the entire course of Asian history. Born on August 31st, 1898, in Villefranche-de-Rouergue in the Aveyron, Navarre came from a military family and had spent the interwar years in intelligence work, developing a reputation for analytical precision and careful planning that made him seem an ideal candidate for complex strategic challenges. He had served in Morocco, had worked in counterintelligence during the Second World War, and had commanded French forces in Germany after the war. When he was appointed Commander-in-Chief in Indochina in May 1953, he arrived with a plan that he believed could reverse the deteriorating French military position against the Viet Minh forces led by General Vo Nguyen Giap. The Navarre Plan, as it became known, was built around the concept of creating a fortified base in the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu, near the Laotian border, that would draw the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle where French firepower and air support would be decisive. The logic seemed sound on the surface. The French had superior artillery, superior air power, and a well-trained garrison. The Viet Minh would have to attack across difficult terrain with supply lines stretched to breaking point. What Navarre and his planners fatally miscalculated was the extraordinary capacity of General Giap and the Viet Minh logistics network. Giap moved approximately 50,000 soldiers and 200 artillery pieces to the surrounding hills overlooking the valley, a feat of human endurance and organizational genius that French intelligence simply refused to believe was possible. The artillery was brought to the hilltops in pieces, carried on the backs of tens of thousands of peasants and soldiers, reassembled under cover, and dug into the hillsides in such a way that French counter-battery fire could not reach them. When the battle began on March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh artillery immediately overwhelmed the French defensive positions. The garrison's colonel of artillery, Charles Piroth, who had personally assured Navarre that Viet Minh artillery could not threaten the base, retired to his bunker and killed himself with a grenade on the night of March 14th to 15th, unable to live with the knowledge that his faulty assessment had contributed to the catastrophe now unfolding. The Battle of Dien. Bien Phu lasted 56 days, from March 13th to May 7th, 1954, and it was one of the most dramatic and terrible battles in the entire history of French arms. The garrison of approximately 13,000 men, including French regulars, foreign legionnaires, Vietnamese soldiers loyal to France, Moroccan and Algerian units, and other colonial troops, was gradually ground down by Viet Minh forces that outnumbered them by roughly 4-1. The surrounding hills were taken one by one, the landing strip was cut, French aircraft attempting to resupply the garrison by parachute dropped supplies that fell increasingly into Viet Minh hands, and the survivors were slowly compressed into a smaller and smaller perimeter as the Vietnamese tunneling operations brought attacking troops to within meters of the French positions. A French relief force, Operation Condor, was planned, but proved impossible to execute given the distances and terrain involved. The garrison suffered approximately 1,800 killed and 3,500 wounded during the fighting. When the final Viet Minh assault overwhelmed the last French positions on the afternoon of May 7, 1954, approximately 10,000 French and Allied soldiers became prisoners of the Viet Minh. The treatment of these prisoners was severe. They were marched hundreds of kilometers to prisoner-of-war camps in the north of Vietnam, in a journey that proved fatal to many. Of the approximately 10,000 who were captured, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 died in captivity from wounds, disease, malnutrition, and the brutal conditions of the march and the camps, a mortality rate that reflected the extraordinary hardships of post-battle captivity in tropical jungle conditions. For Navarre personally, the defeat at Dien Bien Phu was professionally catastrophic. He was recalled from Indochina in June 1954 and replaced. He faced an inquiry into his conduct of the battle and the strategic decisions that had led to it, and while he was not formally court-martialed, his career was effectively over. He spent years writing a detailed defense of his decisions, arguing that he had been let down by inadequate resources, insufficient air support, political interference from Paris, and intelligence failures that were not of his making. His memoir, published in 1956, was a detailed and sophisticated but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to spread the responsibility for Dien Bien Phu across the entire French political and military establishment, rather than concentrating it on his own command decisions. He died in Paris on September 27, 1983, at the age of 85, his name permanently and inseparably linked to one of the greatest military defeats in French history. The post-Dien Bien Phu period opened a new and in some ways even more painful chapter in the story of French soldiers after the Second World War, the Algerian War of 1954 to 1962. The defeat in Indochina had deeply traumatized the French professional military, and many of the officers who had fought in Indochina, who had seen comrades die in the jungle and had watched France abandon the Vietnamese who had fought alongside them, arrived in Algeria with a fixed determination not to allow the same thing to happen again. This psychological state, combined with the extreme brutality of the conflict itself and the conviction among many officers that they were fighting for France's survival as a great power, produced one of the most morally complex and damaging episodes in the history of the French army. An episode whose effects on the institution and on France itself are still felt today. Raoul Salan is perhaps the most extraordinary and in many ways the most troubling figure of this entire era, a man whose career encompassed extraordinary achievement and absolute betrayal, who rose to the very highest rank of the French army and then led a terrorist organization against his own government. Born on June 10, 1899, in Hauteclocque in the Tarn, Salan had built one of the most distinguished careers in the entire French military. He had served in the First World War, had fought in the Rif War in Morocco, had served in Indochina before and during the Second World War, had commanded French forces in Indochina after the war, and had then commanded French forces in Algeria from 1956 to 1958. He had received more decorations than almost any other French officer of his generation, including the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur and the Médaille militaire. He was the most decorated general in the French army when he was appointed military governor of Paris in 1960. His rebellion against de Gaulle's government began with the putsch of April 1961, the attempted military coup in which 4 generals, including Salan, Maurice Schell, André Zeller, and Edmond Giraud, seized control of the French military apparatus in Algeria and attempted to impose their will on Paris. The coup failed. Within 4 days, when the conscript soldiers of the French army in Algeria refused to follow the rebel generals, de Gaulle made a powerful broadcast denouncing the coup and ordering all officers and men to resist it, and the putsch collapsed. The 4 generals dispersed. Chalais and Zeller surrendered to French authorities. Salan went underground, and for the next year he led the Organisation Armée Secrète, the OAS, the terrorist organisation that conducted a bombing and assassination campaign against both Algerian Arabs and French liberals in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to prevent Algerian independence. The OAS killed hundreds of people in Algeria and metropolitan France, planted bombs in markets and cafes, attempted to assassinate de Gaulle himself on multiple occasions, and committed acts of appalling violence that blackened the reputation of the French soldiers associated with the organisation. Salan was captured in Algiers on April 20, 1962. Shortly after Algerian independence had been negotiated, he was tried before the High Military Tribunal in Paris on charges of insurrection, military rebellion, and crimes against the security of the state. The trial was sensational, with Salan's defense counsel brilliantly exploiting the contradictions between Salan's long service record and the charges against him, and with Salan himself remaining largely silent and impassive throughout. In the verdict that shocked France, Salan was found guilty but was not sentenced to death. The High Military Tribunal sentenced him to life imprisonment and degradation from the military. The sentence scandalized de Gaulle, who had expected and privately hoped for the death penalty, and 3 of the jurors resigned in protest at what they considered an insufficiently severe verdict. Salan was imprisoned at the Île de Ré, but was released under an amnesty in 1968 and died in Paris on July 3, 1984, at the age of 84, outliving de Gaulle by more than 13 years. His rehabilitation in the eyes of some as a patriot who had made desperate choices in desperate circumstances, while others regard him as a terrorist and a traitor, has never been resolved, and the question of how history should judge him remains genuinely open. Marcel Bigeard is a name that occupies a uniquely complex place in French military history, beloved by soldiers, controversial among human rights advocates, and politically charged in ways that encapsulate many of the tensions of 20th century France. Born on February 14, 1916, in Toul, Lorraine, Bigeard was not an officer of the traditional military caste. He was the son of a railway worker, had left school at 14 and had worked as a bank clerk before being drafted into the army in 1936. He was an NCO, a sergeant when the war came in 1939, and he was taken prisoner during the fall of France in 1940. He escaped from a prisoner of war camp in 1941, joined the Free French in French West Africa, and rose through the ranks on the basis of extraordinary personal courage and tactical brilliance alone. By the end of the war, he had been promoted to the officer corps and had commanded paratroop units in the liberation campaigns. What defined Bigeard's career, however, was not the Second World War, but the colonial wars that followed it. In Indochina, Bigeard commanded paratroopers in dozens of operations and built a reputation as arguably the finest small unit commander in the French army, a man of legendary energy, personal bravery, and tactical creativity, who inspired devotion in his men bordering on the religious. He was captured at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, survived the brutal march and imprisonment that killed so many of his fellow prisoners, and was eventually repatriated. He then went to Algeria, where he continued to command paratroopers and became one of the central figures of the so-called Battle of Algiers in 1957, the successful but deeply controversial operation in which the French Parachute Corps systematically dismantled the urban network of the Front de Libération Nationale through a combination of intelligence gathering, infiltration, and the systematic use of torture. The role of French paratroopers in the systematic torture of Algerian suspects during the Battle of Algiers was acknowledged by Bigeard himself and by his superiors, and it cast a long and dark shadow over his legacy. Bigeard always maintained that torture had been a military necessity in extreme circumstances, a position that satisfied many French veterans and appalled many others, and the moral question of whether military effectiveness can ever justify such methods remains as unresolved in the French context as it does everywhere else. He retired from the army in 1975 with the rank of General of the Army, 5-star equivalent, served as Secretary of State for Defense from 1975 to 1976, and continued to write and speak about military affairs with great force and conviction until his death. He died in Toul on June 18, 2010, on the anniversary of de Gaulle's famous 1940 broadcast at the age of 94. He was one of the last figures who could claim direct personal experience of the entire sweep of French military history from the Second World War through Indochina and Algeria, and his life contained within it almost all the contradictions and complexity of France's post-war military story. Georges Catroux was among the most senior and diplomatically gifted of all the generals who rallied to de Gaulle in 1940, and his story illustrates the particular challenges faced by officers of very high rank who had to choose between institutional loyalty and personal conviction. Born on January 29, 1877, in Limoges, Catroux was 5-star general and Governor-General of Indochina when the war began. He had served in North Africa, in the Levant, and in diplomatic missions throughout the Middle East, and he combined military capability with considerable diplomatic intelligence, a combination rare enough in any army to make him genuinely exceptional. When France fell, Catroux was one of the very first senior officers to rally to de Gaulle, doing so on June 25, 1940, just days after de Gaulle's famous broadcast. His decision was all the more striking because he significantly outranked de Gaulle, who was merely a 2-star temporary general, and Catroux's adherence gave the Free French immediate credibility and the possibility of real organizational structure. He served in numerous senior capacities throughout the war, including as Commander-in-Chief in the Levant after the victory in the Syrian campaign of 1941, as Minister of State in de Gaulle's Committee of National Liberation, and then after the war in a series of diplomatic positions of the highest importance. Catroux served as Governor-General of Algeria from 1944 to 1948, a posting that placed him at the centre of the first major post-war crisis of French colonialism. The Sétif massacre of May 8, 1945, the very day of Germany's surrender, when French forces killed between 1,000 and 45,000 Algerian Muslims, the estimates range enormously and are politically contested during the brutal suppression of nationalist demonstrations occurred during the period just before Catroux formally took up his Algerian post. His subsequent management of Algeria attempted to balance colonial authority with measured reform, and he was considered one of the more liberal voices within the French colonial administration. In 1956, Prime Minister Guy Mollet appointed him as Resident General in Morocco, a posting that was immediately fiercely opposed by French settlers and that had to be abandoned before it began, with Mollet making the humiliating decision to withdraw Catroux's appointment under settler pressure, an early example of the political dynamics that would eventually produce the crisis of 1958. Catroux died on December 21, 1969 in Paris at the age of 92, one of the longest-lived of all the senior figures of the Free French. Augustin Guillaume represents a type of French officer that was central to the entire story of France's military effort in the Second World War and its aftermath, the colonial general who had built his career and his expertise in the wars of the French Empire and who brought to European warfare the particular skills developed over decades of colonial campaigning. Born on October 3, 1895, in Bourbon-les-Bains in the Haute-Marne, Guillaume had spent much of his career in Morocco, becoming one of the foremost experts in mountain warfare and in the handling of the Moroccan Berber soldiers, the Goumiers and Tabers, who would play such a decisive role in the Italian campaign of 1944. He had served in Morocco since the 1920s, learning Arabic and Berber, understanding the culture and motivations of the men he commanded, and developing the kind of relationship with local troops that produced the extraordinary fighting effectiveness that characterized the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy. Guillaume commanded the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division during the Italian campaign and was present at the breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944, which his Moroccan and Algerian units played a central role in achieving. He continued to command French forces through the liberation of France and into Germany, crossing the Rhine and advancing deep into the Black Forest and Bavaria before the German surrender. After the war, his career continued at the highest levels of the French army. He served as Commander-in-Chief in Morocco from 1951 to 1953, during a period of increasing nationalist agitation, and then as Chief of Staff of the French Army from 1953 to 1954, a posting that saw him presiding over the army during the catastrophe of Dien Bien Phu. He was a member of the French delegation to NATO and served as French representative to the NATO Military Committee. His career illustrated the transition that the French army had to make in the post-war decades from an institution built on imperial service and colonial warfare to one that had to operate within the framework of European collective defence while simultaneously fighting 2 successive colonial wars that ultimately it could not win. He died on March 4, 1983 in Paris at the age of 87. The story of what happened to French soldiers after the Second World War cannot be told without serious attention to the fate of the thousands of soldiers who were not French citizens at all, but who had fought under the French flag and whose treatment after the wars they served in raises profound questions about obligation, loyalty, and justice. The French colonial army in the Second World War, and after it drew on manpower from across the French Empire, from Senegal and other French West African territories, from Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, from Madagascar, from Indochina, and from other territories. These men, variously called tirailleurs sénégalais, spahis, goumiers, tabors, and other designations, contributed enormously to France's military effort. Hundreds of thousands of them served in the liberation campaigns of 1944 and 1945, and a significant proportion were killed or wounded. Their contribution was genuine, it was decisive at key moments, and it deserves recognition. The treatment of these soldiers after the war was, in many cases, deeply unjust. Black African soldiers who had fought in French uniform were subjected to a practice known as the crystallization, the freezing of their pensions at a rate far below what French soldiers of equivalent service received, on the grounds that the cost of living in their home countries was lower than in France. This practice, which was in effect a racial hierarchy applied to military pensions, was not corrected until 2002, when French legislation finally equalised pensions for former colonial soldiers, regardless of their nationality, and even then the equalisation was not fully retroactive. Survivors of the tirailleurs sénégalais, some of them well into their 80s and 90s by then, finally received compensation that was decades overdue. The case of the Tayaroy massacre of December 1, 1944, is particularly harrowing. A group of former prisoners of war, Senegalese soldiers who had been captured by the Germans and were being repatriated through Dakar, demanded the back pay and allowances they were owed, and that had been withheld. The French military response was to open fire on them. The death toll has been disputed, with official French figures citing 35 dead, but other accounts suggesting several hundred were killed. The massacre was suppressed from official French history for decades and only began to receive proper acknowledgement and study in the latter part of the 20th century. The Moroccan Goumiers, who had played such a decisive role at Cassino and in the liberation of France, received particularly complex treatment. Many were repatriated to Morocco after the war and demobilized with relatively little ceremony. France negotiated with the Sultan of Morocco, the monarchy, over the status and compensation of these veterans, but the arrangements were never as generous as the contribution of the Goumiers to French victory had merited. Morocco's independence in 1956, following a turbulent decolonization process that included the deposition and exile of Sultan Mohammed V in 1953, an act that Catrou and others had warned against as politically catastrophic, further complicated the status of Moroccan veterans of the French army, who now found themselves citizens of an independent state with a complex relationship with their former colonial employer. Perhaps the most painful and politically charged case of all, however, was that of the Algerian Harkis, the Algerian Muslims who had served in the French army or as auxiliary forces during the Algerian War of 1954 to 1962. The Harkis numbered approximately 150,000 to 200,000 men, and their motivations for serving France were complex and varied. Some were motivated by personal loyalty to France or to individual French officers. Some were motivated by tribal or regional dynamics that made the FLN their enemies regardless of the colonial question. Some were simply taking the employment that was available in an extremely poor society. Many Harkis and their families made genuine sacrifices for France, providing intelligence, serving as fighters, and risking everything in a conflict where there were no safe bystanders. When the Evian Accords of March 1962 ended the Algerian War and provided for Algerian independence, the fate of the Harkis was one of the most urgent questions. The French government under de Gaulle made the catastrophic decision not to facilitate the evacuation of Harkis and their families to metropolitan France, issuing orders to French military commanders that prohibited them from organizing the transfer of auxiliary forces to France. The rationale was partly logistical, partly political, the concern about the social impact of a mass Muslim immigration to France, and partly a calculation that the FLN had given assurances that former Harkis would not be harmed. Those assurances were worthless. In the months following Algerian independence in July 1962, a wave of retribution killings swept Algeria, as FLN forces and ordinary Algerians killed Harkis and their families in numbers that remain disputed. Estimates of the total dead range from 10,000 to 150,000, with most serious historians settling on figures between 50,000 and 80,000. The killings included summary executions, torture, and prolonged imprisonment. Some Harkis were literally buried alive. Others were thrown into wells. Others were hung from telephone poles. It was a massacre of staggering dimensions, and it happened in part because the French government had both encouraged the Harkis to serve and then abandoned them when their service became politically inconvenient. A relatively small number of Harkis did manage to reach France, sometimes through the initiative of individual French officers who defied the orders from Paris and evacuated their men anyway. These officers, including men like Captain Adolphe Maté and Lieutenants Jean Vianney and others, risked their careers and in some cases received official reprimands for disobeying the order to leave their Harki auxiliaries behind. The approximately 90,000 Harkis who reached France were typically housed in forest camps and former military installations in conditions that were described by subsequent inquiries as inadequate, sometimes approaching the squalid. The French government's treatment of the Harkis, both during the final stages of the Algerian War and in the decades afterward, is one of the most criticised aspects of French post-war history, and successive French presidents have issued apologies that have been received with varying degrees of acceptance by the Harki community and their descendants. President Macron issued one of the most comprehensive apologies in September 2021, acknowledging France's responsibility for the abandonment of the Harkis and for the conditions of their reception in France, though some Harki associations regarded even this as insufficient. The French Foreign Legion, that most extraordinary of military institutions, occupies a unique place in the story of French soldiers after the Second World War, because the Legion was both a French military unit and a profoundly international one, drawing its membership from dozens of nationalities and maintaining a tradition of institutional memory and esprit de corps that transcended the individual soldiers who composed it at any given moment. The Legion had been founded in 1831 by King Louis Philippe for service in the newly conquered Algeria, and in the Yao, more than 190 years since then, it had fought in virtually every conflict France had been involved in, on every continent, in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, and at costs that were sometimes staggering. The Legion's ranks included, in 1945, veterans of the entire span of the Second World War, men who had fought in Norway, in Syria, in North Africa, in Eritrea, in Italy, and in the liberation of France. What made the Legion's post-war story particularly complex was the composition of its membership in the immediate post-war period. The Legion had always accepted foreigners, asking no questions about their backgrounds and providing new identities to those who wanted them, and in 1945 the flood of displaced, stateless or legally compromised Europeans seeking a new identity and a new beginning made the Legion an extremely attractive option for a very particular type of recruit. Among those who enlisted in the Legion in 1945, 1946 and 1947 were former Wehrmacht soldiers, former SS men, Hungarian fascists, Romanian Iron Guardists, Croatian Ustasha fighters, and various other veterans of defeated fascist armies and movements who needed to disappear from a Europe that was actively hunting many of them. The Legion's traditional policy of accepting recruits without inquiring too closely into their past provided cover for men who had very good reasons for not wanting their pasts examined. Estimates suggest that at the peak of the phenomenon, in the late 1940s, former German soldiers and members of the SS and other Nazi organizations may have constituted as much as 30 to 40% of the Legion's enlisted strength. This made for a force of extraordinary combat effectiveness and equally extraordinary moral complexity, an institution that simultaneously represented French military tradition and excellence and harboured within its ranks a significant number of men who had committed serious crimes under the Nazi regime. The Legion served in Indochina from 1945 onward, and its battalions were among the most consistently effective units in the entire French force fighting against the Viet Minh. Legion paratrooper units were deployed in many of the most demanding operations of the campaign, including the final doomed defence of Dien Bien Phu, where the Foreign Legion's 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions fought with extraordinary valour and suffered enormous casualties. After Indochina, the Legion was deployed to Algeria, where it continued to serve with great effectiveness and where the issue of its mixed composition raised particular questions during the Battle of Algiers and the systematic interrogation programme that formed part of it. The Legion's participation in the April 1961 putsch attempt was significant, as the 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment, one of the most celebrated units in the entire Legion, was deeply involved in the coup attempt and was subsequently dissolved as punishment, the regiment being struck from the order of battle in April 1961 in one of the most dramatic institutional punishments in French military history. The regiment's flag and its colours were taken away, its officers were tried and some imprisoned, and the regiment itself ceased to exist, though its traditions were eventually absorbed by other Legion units. The post-war careers of individual Legion soldiers who had served in wartime Germany varied enormously. Those who had been Wehrmacht conscripts with no particular political involvement were often able to rebuild entirely normal lives, either in France or in Germany, after normal diplomatic relations were restored. Those with more complicated pasts either benefited from the Legion's traditional amnesia or found that their pasts eventually caught up with them as West German authorities and international organizations began more systematic investigations of wartime crimes in the late 1950s and 1960s. the establishment of the West German Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes at Ludwigsburg in 1958 created an institutional mechanism for pursuing Nazi war criminals that had not previously existed in an organized form, and some former Legion members found themselves investigated years after they had believed their pasts safely buried. Joseph de Gouala de Montsabert was another of the French generals of the Second World War, whose career combined extraordinary military achievement with a post-war period of considerable difficulty and controversy. Born on September 26, 1887, in Oran, Algeria, Montsabert was a colonial soldier through and through, having spent most of his career in North Africa and Morocco. He commanded the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division during the liberation of Corsica in September and October 1943, a campaign that was significant both militarily and symbolically as the first piece of metropolitan French territory to be liberated. He then commanded the same division during the Italian campaign and during the liberation of France, leading it through southern France and into Alsace. He was known as a highly aggressive, personally brave commander who pushed his men hard and achieved results that more cautious commanders might not have attempted. His men called him Papa Montsabert, a sign of the genuine affection as well as respect he inspired. After the war, Montsabert served as commander-in-chief of French forces in Germany and was involved in the difficult administration of the French occupation zone, which included the Rhineland, parts of Baden-Württemberg, and a sector of Berlin. The administration of the occupation zones was a complex undertaking that combined military governance with the beginnings of the political and economic normalization that would eventually lead to the Federal Republic of Germany. French occupation policy was initially considerably harsher toward Germany than American or British policy, reflecting France's deeper and more personal experience of German invasion and occupation, but it gradually moderated as the Cold War logic of rebuilding West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion superseded the impulse toward punitive occupation. Montsabert retired from active service in 1950 and died in Oran on March 27, 1981, at the age of 93, having outlived most of his contemporaries by a remarkable margin. Pierre Messmer represents a fascinating bridge between the purely military world of the Free French and the political world of the post-war French Republic. Born on March 20, 1916 in Vincennes near Paris, Messmer attended the prestigious École nationale de la France d'Outre-mer, which prepared officers for the colonial service, and joined the Free French immediately after the fall of France. He served as a foreign legionnaire and paratrooper throughout the war, fighting in Eritrea, in North Africa, in Italy, and in the liberation campaigns in France and Germany. He was one of the very small number of volunteers who had parachuted into occupied France to support resistance operations, and he was captured by the Gestapo in 1944, held briefly, and managed to escape. His wartime record was one of almost unbroken active service and genuine personal courage. After the war, Messmer chose not to remain in the military, but moved into the colonial administration and then into politics. He served as Minister of the Armed Forces from 1960 to 1969, a tenure of 9 years that made him one of the longest-serving defense ministers in French history, overseeing the French nuclear program, the withdrawal from Algeria, and the rebuilding of French conventional forces within the NATO framework. He later served as Prime Minister of France from 1972 to 1974 under President Pompidou, one of the few men in French political history who could claim both the Cross of the Liberation, the most exclusive military decoration in France, awarded only to a relatively small number of companions who had rallied to de Gaulle before June 23, 1943, and the highest civilian offices in the French Republic. He died in Paris on August 29, 2007, at the age of 91, one of the last survivors of the original generation of free French volunteers. Pierre Billotte was another figure who crossed the boundary between the military and political worlds that was characteristic of so many free French veterans. Born on March 8, 1906 in Paris, he was the son of General Gaston Billotte, who had commanded the Northern French Army Group during the disastrous Battle of France in 1940, and who had died in a car accident on May 21, 1940. In circumstances that denied France one of its few potentially effective senior commanders at the most critical moment of the battle. The younger Billotte had escaped from German captivity in 1941, after an extraordinary journey through the Soviet Union and then to England, and joined the Free French. He commanded the famous column that liberated Paris on August 25, 1944, leading French armoured vehicles into the capital under fire, and was present at the German surrender of Paris alongside Leclerc. After the war, he followed a career in politics rather than remaining in the military, serving as a deputy in the National Assembly from 1946 onward and holding various ministerial positions, including Minister of Defence from 1955 to 1956. He died on March 27, 1992, in Paris, at the age of 85, his life bookending the entire era, from the catastrophe of 1940 through the reconstruction of France in the post-war decades. The experience of ordinary French soldiers who had neither the distinction to achieve fame nor the crimes to merit trial was, in many ways, the most representative story of what happened to French soldiers after the Second World War, and it was not always a triumphant or even a comfortable one. The men who had fought in de Gaulle's Free French forces, who had crossed the desert and the sea and had liberated their country, returned home to a France that, initially, celebrated them with genuine warmth but quickly moved on to the pressing business of reconstruction. The social and economic difficulties of post-war France were enormous. The country had been ravaged by 4 years of occupation, with significant portions of its infrastructure destroyed either by the Germans or by Allied bombing, with its economy disrupted, its institutions compromised, and its society deeply divided by the experience of occupation and the violence of the liberation. The returning soldiers had to reintegrate into a society that was changing rapidly, that was building new social institutions, new economic structures and a new political framework, and that did not always have time or attention for the particular experiences and needs of its veterans. The veterans' associations that formed in the immediate post-war years played an important role in preserving the memory of the various French military experiences of the war and in lobbying for better treatment of former soldiers. The major associations included the Fédération Nationale des Anciens Prisonniers de Guerre, representing the former POWs, the various associations of free French veterans grouped around the Order of the Liberation, and the associations of veterans of the different campaigns and theatres. These organisations provided social support, legal assistance in navigating the pension and benefit systems, and a collective voice for veterans' interests in a political system that was often more absorbed in current politics than in the obligations of the past. The pension system for French veterans of the Second World War was established relatively quickly after the liberation. But the bureaucratic complexity of determining who qualified for what, given the extraordinary variety of circumstances in which French soldiers had served, created ongoing disputes and injustices that dragged on for decades. The psychiatric and psychological consequences of the war for French veterans were handled very poorly by the standards of any era, including the standards of the time. The concept of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognized in French military medicine or in French society more broadly, and veterans who suffered from what contemporaries might have described as nerves or shell shock or simply difficulties readjusting were expected to pull themselves together and get on with life. Many did, with varying degrees of success. Others found the adjustment deeply difficult and sought relief in alcohol, in isolation, in aggression, or in other behaviours that reflected unresolved psychological trauma. The suicide rate among veterans in the immediate post-war years, though not systematically studied at the time, appears from fragmentary evidence to have been elevated compared to the general population, particularly among those who had experienced the worst forms of captivity or combat. The French soldiers who had fought in Indochina after the Second World War and those who subsequently fought in Algeria experienced a very particular form of the veterans' experience that was shaped by the politics of decolonization. The soldiers of Dien Bien Phu who returned from Vietnamese captivity in 1954 came back to a France that was exhausted by the war, deeply divided about the wisdom of having fought it at all, and that greeted them with a mixture of sympathy and a desire to turn the page and move on. The humiliation of Dien Bien Phu had made Indochina a subject that France preferred not to dwell on, and the men who had fought there often found themselves celebrated in military circles but largely invisible in the broader cultural conversation. The same pattern repeated itself even more sharply after Algeria. The veterans of the Algerian War returned to a France that was politically and socially exhausted by 8 years of bitter conflict, that was deeply divided about the methods used and the outcome achieved, and that preferred silence to confrontation with the full moral complexity of what the war had involved. The use of systematic torture by French forces in Algeria, documented by numerous witnesses and acknowledged by military commanders, was a subject that French society avoided openly confronting for decades. It was not until 2001 that a major French newspaper published an account by a retired general acknowledging the systematic nature of the torture program, triggering a national debate that was long overdue and that has still not fully run its course. The soldiers of the Algerian War, including both those who had served loyally within the framework of the French state and those who had participated in the April 1961 Putsch or the OAS campaign, eventually benefited from a series of amnesty laws that effectively closed the legal files on most of the crimes and abuses of the conflict. The amnesty of 1968 covered most of the remaining charges against OAS members and putschist officers, and the gradual rehabilitation of figures like Salan, who was released in that same year, represented a French decision, not unlike the German amnesty decisions of the 1950s, to draw a line under the past and focus on the future. Whether this decision was wise or merely convenient, whether the historical reckoning that was thereby avoided was simply postponed rather than escaped, are questions that French historians and public figures continue to debate. The story of what happened to French soldiers after World War II is ultimately a story about a nation grappling with the full weight of its history, with the contradictions between the France that had surrendered and collaborated and the France that had resisted and liberated itself, with the obligations of empire and the reality of decolonization, with the demands of justice and the requirements of national reconstruction. The soldiers whose stories this video has followed, from the martyred veterans of Vichy to the heroes of the free. French, from the survivors of 5 years behind German wire to the veterans of Dien Bien Phu and the streets of Algiers, were all in different ways carrying the weight of a history that France is still sorting through decades later. The individual fates were as varied as the men themselves. Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, died a prisoner on a small island, his life's work turned to ash by the choices of his final years. Maxime Weygand lived to 97, writing his memoirs and insisting to the last that he had done what he could. Charles de Gaulle died a private man in a village church, his legacy both the Fifth Republic that bears his constitutional imprint and the profound national narrative of resistance that he had almost single-handedly created. Jean de Lattre de Tassigny died fighting his final battle against cancer in 1952, at 62, mourned by a nation that recognized it had lost its finest soldier. Leclerc died in a desert plane crash at 45, leaving behind the legend of the oath he had kept. Alphonse Juin reached the dignity of Marshal and died in 1967, the last of his military generation. Marie-Pierre Kœnig, who had held Bir Hakeim against impossible odds, died in 1970, his heroism secure in history. Joseph Darlan, who had turned his genuine wartime courage into the service of fascist repression, died before a firing squad in 1945. Henri carried the burden of Dien Bien Phu until his death in 1983. Raoul Salan, the most decorated soldier who became a terrorist, died in 1984, never fully accepted or finally condemned. Marcel Bigeard, who had survived captivity and had commanded with brilliance and with cruelty, lived to 94 and remained controversial to the end. The Harkis died in their tens of thousands, abandoned by the country they had served, and their descendants are still seeking the full acknowledgement of what was done to their parents and grandparents. France, after the Second World War, was not simply a country that had been occupied and liberated. It was a country that had fought within itself, that had seen its own soldiers on both sides of the same battles, that had produced collaborators and heroes from the same families, the same villages, the same military schools. Working out what all of that meant, assigning the proper weight of honour and blame, finding the genuine lesson beneath the competing narratives, has been the work of the decades since, and in many ways it is still not complete. The soldiers whose stories we have told in this video were men of their time, shaped by circumstances of extraordinary violence and moral complexity, and their individual choices, good and bad, heroic and contemptible, have left a legacy that France continues to live with today. Among the lesser-known but genuinely significant figures of the Free French Forces was Jacques-Philippe Leclerc's chief of staff and one of his most trusted subordinates, Colonel Paul de Langlade, who commanded the Groupement Tactique de Langlade within the 2nd French Armoured Division during the liberation of Paris and the subsequent campaigns through France and into Germany. De Langlade was born in 1908 and had served in the cavalry, the kind of mobile warfare that the armoured forces had effectively replaced and had adapted with considerable skill to the demands of mechanised combat. His column was one of three that entered Paris on August 24th and 25th, 1944, and he was among the officers who witnessed the formal German surrender of the city. After the war, he continued in military service, commanding various cavalry and armoured units during the early Cold War period and contributing to the rebuilding of French conventional forces within the new NATO framework. He died in 1994 at the age of 86, his role in the liberation of Paris secure, but his name far less celebrated than those of Leclerc and Billotte. His story is representative of the many officers just below the top rank whose contributions were essential but whose individual fame has not survived the passage of time. The role of French naval forces in the Second World War and their fate afterward deserves specific attention, particularly given the extraordinary circumstances of the French Navy's position after the armistice of June 1940. The French fleet, the Marine Nationale, was the fourth largest in the world when war began, comprising modern battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines of considerable quality. The armistice terms required that the fleet be demobilized and placed under German and Italian supervision, but not handed over to the Axis powers, a provision that was of critical importance because the Germans were determined to prevent the French ships from joining the Royal Navy. The British attack on Mers el-Kebir on July 3, 1940, in which the Royal Navy destroyed or disabled most of the French fleet at anchor, killing nearly 1,300 French sailors, was motivated by the fear that these ships might fall into German hands and be used against British convoys in the Atlantic. The decision remains one of the most controversial of the entire war, universally condemned by French naval officers of every political persuasion, including those who had chosen to fight on with the Free French. Admiral James Somerville, who commanded the British force that carried out the attack, reportedly wept afterward, recognising that he had been ordered to fire on former allies and had done so with devastating effect. A portion of the French Navy's submarines and smaller vessels had escaped to Britain or to other locations and joined the Free French naval forces, but the bulk of the fleet remained in French colonial ports under Vichy control. The fleet stationed at Toulon, the principal French naval base on the Mediterranean, was scuttled by its own crews on November 27, 1942, when German forces moved to seize the ships following the Allied landings in North Africa. This act of self-destruction, carried out by French sailors on their own vessels to prevent them from falling into German hands, was one of the most dramatic moments of the entire war, and was regarded by Vichy naval officers as a final act of defiance and honour within the constraints of their impossible position. Approximately 77 warships were scuttled, including the battleships Strasbourg and Provence, 3 heavy cruisers, 9 light cruisers, and scores of smaller vessels. It was the largest single self-scuttling in naval history, and it effectively ended the Vichy naval threat in the Mediterranean, even as it denied the Germans the prize they had been seeking. French naval officers who had served in the Vichy Navy faced varying degrees of scrutiny after the liberation. Those who had participated in operations against Allied forces, including the brief engagements during the November 1942 landings in North Africa, faced potential charges, though most were eventually integrated into the reconstituted French Navy without significant legal consequences. The officers who had ordered the Toulon scuttling were generally treated with considerable respect, their final act of defiance being seen as redemptive of the years of serving a collaborationist regime. The officers who had commanded the ships sunk at Mers el-Kebir occupied a particular psychological space, men who had been attacked by their former allies, whose sailors had died in those attacks, and whose bitterness toward Britain never fully healed. Several wrote memoirs in the post-war years exploring their experiences, and the collective memory of Mers el-Kebir remained a painful undercurrent in French naval culture for decades. Among the French naval officers who had joined the Free French, the most significant was Vice Admiral Émile Muselier, who organised the Free French naval forces in 1940 and built them from almost nothing into an effective fighting force. Born on June 17, 1882 in Marseille, Muselier was a controversial figure, forceful, capable, and deeply difficult to work with. He had a famously turbulent relationship with de Gaulle, and in 1942 he made an attempt to break away from Gaullist authority in the aftermath of the controversial seizure of Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, 2 small French islands off the Newfoundland coast, which Muselier had taken in December 1941 in a move that caused a diplomatic crisis with the United States. His subsequent attempt to assert independence from de Gaulle resulted in his removal from command of the Free French naval forces, and he spent the rest of the war in effective marginalization, never reconciling with de Gaulle or recovering his position. After the war, he remained a private citizen, writing memoirs that were sharply critical of de Gaulle, and died in Paris on September 3, 1965, at the age of 83. His relationship with de Gaulle illustrated the intense political and personal tensions within the Free French movement. Tensions that were never fully resolved even after liberation. One of the genuinely remarkable and too often overlooked aspects of the French military experience during and after the Second World War was the role of the French resistance fighters who were eventually integrated into the regular armed forces. The Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, the FFY, numbered approximately 500,000 fighters by the time of the liberation, ranging from highly organized networks with military training and weapons supplied by Allied airdrops to loosely affiliated groups of individuals who had simply taken up arms against the occupiers in the final weeks of the liberation campaign. The task of integrating these fighters into a coherent regular military force was one of the most challenging organizational tasks faced by the French army in the immediate post-liberation period, and it was accomplished with imperfect but ultimately reasonable success. Many FFI fighters were absorbed into regular French units in the summer and autumn of 1944 and participated in the campaigns in France, Alsace, and Germany. Others were given demobilization papers and returned to civilian life. The psychological and social situation of resistance veterans was complex. They had in many cases made extraordinary sacrifices, risking and losing their lives and those of their families in the service of France. They had operated in conditions of extreme fear and violence, living with the constant possibility of arrest, torture, and execution. And they emerged from the war to find that the society around them was already developing a mythology of the resistance that was, in important ways, more comforting than accurate. The idea that France had been overwhelmingly resistant, that the collaboration was the exception and not in some areas the rule, that the majority of French people had supported the resistance even if only in their hearts, was a necessary national fiction that served the purposes of reconstruction and reconciliation, but that obscured the more uncomfortable truth about the extent of collaboration and the relatively small number of active resistance during most of the occupation period. The genuine heroes of the resistance found themselves simultaneously celebrated as symbols and somewhat lost within a narrative that was being used for purposes beyond their individual experiences. The French army that emerged from the Second World War was a very different institution from the one that had marched proudly into the catastrophe of 1940. It was an army that had known defeat and humiliation, that had served under an occupying power and had chosen collaboration, and that had then rebuilt itself through extraordinary effort and will and had marched back into Paris under its own flag. It was an army that drew on the manpower of empire and that would spend the next 2 decades in the painful process of discovering that empires did not last forever. It was an army that produced both men of the very highest honour and men of the most profound dishonour, sometimes from the same background and the same training. It was, in short, a human institution, with all the complexity and contradiction that implies operating in the most extreme circumstances that human beings can face. The story of what happened to French soldiers after World War II is, in the end, the story of France itself, incomplete, contested, and always more complicated than any single narrative can fully capture. Well, that is it for today. We hope you found this journey through the extraordinary fates of French soldiers after the Second World War both informative and thought-provoking. The stories of these men, from the heroes of Bir Hakeim and the liberators of Paris to the prisoners behind German wire and the tragic figures of Dien Bien Phu, are among the most dramatic and complex in all of 20th century history. If you enjoyed learning about this topic, make sure to check out our video on what happened to German field marshals after World War II for a fascinating look at the other side of the same story. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more extraordinary history. We will see you in the next one.